We appear to be live.
All right. Welcome to Southern Oregon Progressive Podcast. I'm Betsy Cunningham, your host, and I'm joined in the room with by John and Zach, who have been weekly attendings for most of this. And so I'll let the two of you introduce yourselves, and then we'll kind of jump into the free for all.
Okay, I'll go for it. I'm John Hunter. I'm with Community Rights Douglas County, and I'm on the board of the Oregon Community Rights Network.
I'm Zach. I'm a PhD student in history at the University of Oregon, involved with the Institute for Social Ecology in Vermont, and always happy to be here.
All right. So, like I mentioned, there's a big long list behind me of things. Uh, we actually started talking, right, about the Elk Island LLC labor camps. Uh, Bernie Woodard, who is indicated on, I guess, public documents as manager, but frankly, most people in this community who know who he is and who has kind of known who he is trying to redevelop the downtown waterfront, right? I think that was his aspirations, when he first came here. Kind of know who he is and see him as the primary driver of this stuff. He certainly is the front person. So what happened, let me see, I think I actually uh, put some story is after we met last week, there was two stories that came out, and I thought I had put them up on my save them, but they were grants pass, and that's why I can't see them because so I hopefully am going to share this. And if not, we'll just talk about it because that might take back a while. Less time than me sharing the dang thing. Let me see. So here's number one. Bernie Grants Pass re-awarded a $1.2 million homeless grant. A Roseburg developer plans a container home village for 150 people by summer. So this is what happened is the city of Grants Pass, under a settlement and a lawsuit, decided to create 150 or up to 150 people, or at least 150. I think the settlement might have been. They were sued at the beginning of the year on behalf of people with disabilities who are also homeless by some individuals in the suit, but also the um, Disability Rights Oregon, which is not only a nonprofit law firm that specializes in disabilities, it's also the adult protection and advocacy organization designated as such in Oregon. So they were, suing on that capacity. And keep in mind, this is all after the stuff regarding the Supreme Court case, which was also another grants pass case, which looked at whether the cruel and unusual, and that's all it looked at, is whether the cruel and unusual amendment to the Constitution prevented the criminalizing or giving tickets, or actually giving tickets to people who were homeless. And the Supreme Court said, no, it's not a violation of the Eighth Amendment. And so people started ramping up their sweeps, like the city of Roseburg started to do that and thought that gave them carte blanche. And the reality check was the Oregon law that was HR 3115 that passed, I think it was a couple of 4 years ago in the state legislature, that created time, place, and manner, which required cities, in order for them to actually have anti-camping ordinances, would have to designate a, objectively reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on people. And so this was really kind of an ADA case, and under the state law, which has nothing to do with the U.S. Supreme Court decision. And that's, where I think the state, and interestingly, if people don't know this, and this has been happening, but they're trying to get a statewide initiative, I think, on the ballot in order to um, get rid of this time, place, and manner, and want to put no restrictions on cities, which is, what they ostensibly had prior to all that stuff happening. So in this settlement, and I say all this to say this is why grants pass, because of that case that was filed in the beginning of the year. And the judge actually issued an order against them. The judge in the case, a temporary and then a preliminary injunction pending the outcome of the case, that they would not be able to enforce their rules. And so the city of Grants Pass smartened up. I mean, that's the way I look at it, and at least, agreed to do this. The settlement agreement also allows the Disability Rights Oregon to help oversee, how it actually operates. So I will say, on full disclosure, when they were had the bid out, somebody that I'm aware of in Grants Pass messaged me and said, "Hey, do you know this guy?" Because he was one of the bidders of the original contract. And I said, "Oh, glad you asked." And I said, "Yes." And so I actually wrote an email, sent an email to the city manager of Grants Pass, and as well as the Disability Rights Oregon, regarding what had happened regarding Bernie Woodard at Elk Island LLC and what he had been doing, not just this time, but what I mentioned last week. He actually did this, in 2015, 16 or so, when he had an encampment on Elk Island, and the city shut him down because they hadn't even authorized such thing. So I had done that before the original contract was awarded. There was another company group that had come together with different agencies that looked like um, the original one that says Pathways to Stability, but apparently they could not locate a place for this to happen by the deadline was set. So this is why they transferred. And apparently, in that bidding process, Bernie Woodard, Elk Island LLC was in the second place, and so they decided, the majority of the city council, instead of rebidding it or asking for better proposals, whatever, decided to grant it to them on the contingent they have a property by a certain date, which is it's a very short window. So if he doesn't secure the property, then there's an issue. There's not an issue. So I think, anybody have any comment about this particular story?
Well, considering the character of Bernie Woodard's camps in Roseburg, I only see this $1.2 million uh, potential investment in his activities in similarly in Grants Pass is this is exactly the direction that Grants Pass was aiming for, it seems to me. Since they did move to effectively criminalize homelessness in the city.
Well, the it the whole idea of that kind of money being put into camps, I have to say, my personal opinion has always been that is really contrary to getting people off the streets. It certainly is counter to a housing first model. The reality is we don't have all the housing available. And when you keep feeding this kind of money into this system of trying to manage homelessness, uh, it's it's not sustainable. I mean, that's the reality. And is that really going to be the replacement for permanent housing? That, what is the city in Grants Pass? And I would say the same is true for the city of Roseburg as well. Um, and so what I did do, and I'll talk just a little bit about it. I did um, reach out to this reporter about the other article. And I think this is, yeah, Jane Vaughn did the other article uh, which is she's out of um, Jefferson Public Radio.
Yep.
And I so three camps are owned and operated not by the city, but by Oak Island and ownership subdivided real estate. So but this is, I think her caption, her title got it right. Roseburg's private homeless camp lures business and charity. I think it's actually worse than just luring charity. And I think we went into a lot of that, in detail last Sunday. And I reached out to her about this particular story. That was what really more my focus was, to kind of give her a heads up of some information she may not have been aware of based upon who she spoke with. So I will be keeping in touch with her regarding this. And I want to say, although Octavia was here on Housing for Simcoe last week, and certainly I am very well associated with that. I would be doing this even if Housing for Simcoe did not exist. As in the past, the person who co-founded Housing for Simcoe with me um, in 2019, we've known each other for what, 35 years or more, 40 years, and have been engaged in stuff advocating in anti-poverty issues, particularly around housing and homeless issues, even just as ourselves. So this, to me, this is really kind of the exploitation that we shouldn't really just let happen. But I'm going to tell you again from my own experience, I mentioned before that, really much change is people demanding change. People in this community have known about this exploitation going on. And I wanted to, and the other side, um, that's not the one I want, and maybe I won't even see it. And the other one I pulled out of this article that I've been posting all around just for fun is Mayor Rich finds Woodard untrustworthy. This is all really a quote because that was just all of it was pulled out of the article. Me personally, in terms of, do I call him a liar? Yeah. Do I call him a fraudster? Yeah. He said some of them call him the snake oil salesman. And so I haven't done that yet. I just call him a fraudster. All right. So I'll let you guys comment on that.
I I don't know. I thought it was kind of like the pot, the pot calling the pot calling the kettle black for one thing. It's kind of like, I mean, we could, you know, but as you said too, it's kind of amazing that a public official would even go on record as saying, it, in the past in the past they wouldn't have been that blunt. But with Trump now, everything's, you know, it doesn't matter
No
anymore.
filters.
Yeah,
Yeah, no filters.
yeah.
Um,
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I was under the impression that Bernie Woodard's camps were being considered by Mayor Rich and the city council as um, part of a threshold on space for unhoused folks they're required to meet.
they they've never been sued, right? So the city has never been sued, but the time, place, and manner restrictions, that are in the state law do have a requirement of shelter, right? And the time, place, and manner restrictions. So, in theory, but it's also a commitment that they had made when they were getting the money during the pandemic, right? That they had set aside these urban campgrounds. Then, they were trying to, the city has always, when they've done any effort like this, has tried not to do it themselves, right? They want some other entity to do it. And at some level, I guess they thought that was uh changing the ordinance to allow it. Why don't you, because there was a we would people would raise the issue. Why don't you let people camp on people's property, right? And what about churches, parking lots? There's a variety of places here that, why don't we allow this to happen? Because we are really in a housing crisis and a homeless crisis. So, in an effort, I guess, to appease and appear to comply with state um, law coming down regarding an ability to have a prohibited camping law, may have been the motive, but I don't. I'm just extrapolating because of hanging around and following this stuff for so long. It was, but it is then can say we have the navigation center, right? We have these places and people have places to be. And that's been the rub. Like some activists, like say the Western Regional Advocacy Project, they've never been really strong on supporting and even oppose urban campgrounds because they just see that is not really a good use of effort. It doesn't solve anything. It makes people, and then it does make the argument, well, there are spaces in these organized camps, and if you don't go there, then you can be ticketed. Then you can have criminal charges. So that's kind of the mix of how this whole thing works. And I get it. I mean, that is certainly the flaw in saying here there's designated places. The reality is they're probably never going to designate enough places, and the way they're going now, that's pretty clear, to deal with all the people who are living outside. So as long as those things can be full, but my concern is they're not full, and who are they going to end up, who's going to end up being in trouble by not going there, right? The same group of people that are the highest at risk right now. Right? So it doesn't provide anything better. And then how does someone with severe persistent mental illness argue they can't go to those camps, right? It's yeah, it's just not um it's a way to try to ignore the problem or worse yet, penalize people. And how does that productive?
Well, it says to me, especially based on our last conversation and what's explicitly been said in the JPR article, that a camps that are being described by experts and by people in them as being uh, slavery, a form of slavery or indentured servitude, which historically in colonial America could often be just as brutal, if not more brutal, than chattel enslavement.
Mhm.
Uh, those are, in this case, being used to um, prop up a criminalization system.
Yes.
So there is no escape from capture in this. Either you go to the work camp or you are fined and thrown in jail. That seems to,
That's
unless it's not enforced.
Yeah, yeah. And it's always that threat, right, of enforcement, right, to control people, right? That you may not be it may not be enforced today, but if you do something they don't quite like for whatever reason, that's not a battle someone who's homeless is going to win about against the police,
Yeah.
right? That it's selectively enforced to target certain people they don't particularly like or don't like the behavior of, can't do anything to them criminally in other ways, but use this as a ruse in which to actually go after some people that they don't like. And like, well, we can't certainly be naive enough to don't think that happens. I mean, even the homeless people living out on the street tell us that.
Mhm.
That's their perception. There's people, well, if you just do this, they won't harass you, but there's certain people for some reason they go after all the time. So yeah. And I think that's one of the reasons the Western Regional Advocacy Project was as a long time advocate, has been in the forefront of this since the 80s, in a different name, but actually, the people involved in it, that would be their hard stance, I think, is that, these, shouldn't exist at all. Let's just quit talking about, any of these encampments. The problem is when we live here and anywhere, but when you live here, looking at it in Roseburg, that is something that you can't sell, and we get the system that we have right now, where these sweeps all the time, that a lot of the calls for service. I think that there was this quoted in one of the articles in one of these about 1,000 calls to service within a certain period of time that and they were comparing it to one of Bernie's camps, or all of them 71 service calls. That's a huge difference. And think of what that calls costs us taxpayers, um, for all of the service. And what is it? That increases whatever service shows up. It could be just law enforcement, but then it could be law enforcement, and it can be emergency, ambulance and fire. It can be crisis intervention. And so all these things, all these resources expended, which are probably not surprisingly reduced when people have places to go where they're left alone, right? I mean, they're not left alone in Bernie's camp, but they're left alone by that particular problem with the police, being worried about the police just showing up, and not just sweeps. I mean, we hear each report over and over again of the cops showing up at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock in the morning at these camp to say, hey, we're looking for somebody. Well, what in the heck are they looking for somebody that might be in a tent and sleeping at 3 o'clock in the morning that they can't wait until the next day to do? To me, that's not legitimate law enforcement. If that's what's happening, that sounds like harassment, right? It's just another, example of what I think is psychological terrorism
Yeah, well, that's where the
perpetuated.
cruelty really lies, is
Yeah.
the psychological terrorism, the
Yes.
fear, the anxiety, and the so-called choice between
Hmm.
being criminally punished or enslaved.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's where, I kind of, made that point about funneling, and my concern is about the city council. At this point, they are players in this funneling to these labor camps, right? Because if they're saying, well, either go to the labor camp or we're going to do this to you, right? If you're at the
Mhm.
labor camp, it doesn't happen. And people truly, we talked about Joe, who we're gonna launch, do his whole video. It's about 10 minutes on tomorrow. HF Fused TV is what we're launching tomorrow with that story of Joe's example of what's happening. But that was his, right? And there's someone else who has since moved out to a place that I'm trying to get in touch with, who might be willing to tell their story as well, but they don't want to tell it when it's there, right? If they don't want to be kicked out and have to go to the Point or Deer Creek Park or anywhere else. I mean, it's not just there, because there's people that are sleeping in, numerous places in the city of Roseburg, but they just don't want to be, in that loop of being chased around.
Mhm. Yeah. It seems to me uh, pretty foundational to so-called communities like Roseburg. And I know, as I was talking about indentured servitude in colonial America, and there was a time in the 1600s up into the early 1700s when a pretty huge portion of the population, the colonial population of, say, the American South, colonies like Maryland, uh, there were upwards of like 75% of women even at some points, who were indentured servants and lived in brutal conditions. And there were some accounts of people saying that they were treated worse than black slaves, uh, people being whipped and like given basically no food and no clothes. And these are people who were taken advantage of, people who were living in poverty in places like England who had nowhere else to go and were tricked into servitude. Which and it's the term the transatlantic slave trade system of indentured servitude that builds the early American colonies in the United States. One thing that we don't often call those things, despite, slavery itself being on its own horrible, indentured servitude on its own being horrible. These are systems of human trafficking, which is to say, we're not just, the United States is not just economically and socially based in slavery and unfree servitude, but it's also based in trafficking. It's essential to those institutions. And that does not go away so easily. That's pretty ingrained in not just old wealth in the United States, but it's built into the fabric of how even communities like ours were formed. It's an age-old problem that's always age-old. Well, it's an old problem that is rising to the surface in new forms again and again. Um, Not that history repeats itself, but there are clear similarities, and uh, and I only see this as rooted in that kind of origin in American unfreedom.
Yeah. And it's this, and part of it wrapped up in this idea that everybody has to take care of themselves, right? So, and if you don't, then you give up the right to be free. And even without committing a crime, or, what we do in this society is we create a crime. When people, it's even with immigration, right? Immigration was not a crime until we made it a crime, right? Or, you didn't have to have documents to come to the United States at one point, right? And now we say, oh, those people are criminal, as if they were, equal to a murderer, right? Or some other, horrific crime. And the same with homelessness, right? That it was a crime. And, going back to, I keep in mind that, Western Regional Action Project says, Okie laws, right? And that kind of stuff you can just see in the history of America, right? The sundown laws, right? um, you can loiter, right? You would be arrested for just existing outside, um, and not having something productive to do, which is very counter to the idea of freedom, right? Of human freedom, is you
Yeah.
can't just be somewhere. And for a while, we were in fact addressing those on, civil liberties cases, and a lot of, court cases that ended up protecting the rights, making, panhandling part of free speech, right, and protected, to some degree in free speech. Um, but now, it's, has turned the other way, and as more and more people are homeless, certainly have become a main topic of this, without wanting to put the corresponding resources into it, right? We haven't even feigned being able to say, oh, we have a place for you to go, and so if you don't, we're going to lock you up, right? They don't have one. They don't really legitimately have one for most people. And some people will, can't even fit into the navigation center, which is probably a whole lot easier environment for people to be in to some degree, but not if you have certain mental health issues, and what you're going to be is in, with 40 other people, right? um, and so we don't accommodate those kinds of things, and somehow we still think, well, they have to do something. Well, what they need to be is housed, right? And then figure out what other things you think they should be doing. And then the question is why? Because most people would not even care about this subject if what you see happening at the point, if those people were housed, right? there would be no, there wouldn't be a public spectacle for us to observe and start bitching about.
Yeah.
For most, I would think,
Mm.
I would hope.
Well, there is an element of the Roseburg City Council and the mayor's um, uh, approach to this, looking really for market solutions of of hoping that some private party is going to step in and solve the problem. There's an implicit view of themselves, of the government of Roseburg itself as being inept. It's incapable of taking care of the people of the community. It's incapable of doing what many of us expect the government to actually do, is keep a city hospitable for all of its residents. Well, I don't think
Well,
everyone thinks that, but some of us sure do.
and part of that continuing on is, some of them, I think we touched on this before, don't fundamentally believe it's the role of government to do, right? I disagree. I think that actually is the fundamental the fundamental roles of government is to take care of its citizens, right? It's not to criminalize them. If they're and in this instance, there's actually a better solution than criminalizing people and something that actually could work. But I think their political belief system has them so skewed, and that they can't see it. Well, they have to be doing something. And remembering, I brought this up before, the city councilor, who's no longer there, didn't want to provide porta potties because it would enable people to be homeless, right? The ludicrousness of of that kind of, thought process. Well, if we give it to them, then they're going to want to continue to be homeless. Yeah,
Mhm.
I'm not sure that the porta potty is the deal.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, that's how even hunger is a strategy. Hunger, there are some schmucks who will outrightly admit this, but keeping people hungry, unhoused, miserable, they see as an incentive to force them to work.
yeah. Mhm. Yep, absolutely true. That they think that somehow they're going to miraculously be able to work, and the reality is that most people that are living on the street right now currently are not able to work a full-time job, for many reasons, including just the logistics of having a full-time job and being homeless. That may happen when you're relatively new to homelessness, or you are, homeless, and still have a job, but when you're talking about chronic homelessness, that just isn't really. And I've professionally done vocational rehabilitation stuff as an advocate and worked with kids with disabilities, and look at vocational training option for a variety of folks. And there's a thing that, I've even represented people in Social Security cases, and my argument is the person can get employed, they just can't stay employed, right? So there are factors that play a role. And so, like, go get a job, you bum, is that is really
Yeah.
a very simplistic way to address it. So,
Well,
John, you
There's a similarity to people who are exiting incarceration as well.
yes,
Might leave prison after serving a term and have nothing and no aid, if at all, on the inside, but certainly not on the outside. And it's an easy pathway straight back into a cell.
right. And as I understand the criminal justice system, and most of my stuff around legal stuff is civil litigation and poverty law stuff. It's not criminal law stuff. But there's no requirement that people actually participate in programs. Those are incentives.
Mhm.
So somebody can leave prison, and maybe get a few $100, to solve their housing problem, but they have to be housed, and theoretically there's accountability, but really what I have seen, it's only theoretical. And I know that people go, there's a particular program like for drugs, it's called, I think it's our residential substance abuse treatment, RSAT, I think is the acronym. And people are theoretically given some money to get housed when they leave if they participate in an RSAT on the program. But the last I paid attention to that, which has been a few years now, it wasn't enough money to make a difference.
Mhm.
They really just didn't even fundamentally give somebody. So you're going to give them $1,500 to get themselves permanently housed. They don't
Yeah.
have a job. They may not have any income, when they're let out in the, back into society when they're paroled. Yeah. So you're right. It's very similar to that system as well. So you have people that are in that, category of that. And I was mentioning to somebody, if you're a veteran, you're more likely to get housed than any other category of people that I'm aware of these days. That there are services for veterans, but the problem still arises is availability of real housing. And there are more, what I would say, housing first models of housing, not making it conditioned for someone to get, if there's a house available, they don't have to participate necessarily in programs. But there really is always this hope from agencies that they do, or pretty much probably the funders really are kind of pushing that stuff. So the other side of this, unless you want to talk more about the two things in the encampment, the Mayor Rich statement, and that was not the only statement, it was just the most fun. So he did go on a little bit more, um, or started a little bit more. And I look at it and, I can't say on the issue of homelessness, I very often agree with Mayor Rich. I might agree with his personal assessment of, the perception that Bernie gives, the way he, the kind of things he's been involved in. And certainly it says exploitation. And I can't have no way to be able to back down from that because that's just the way that I see that. But then let's say we as citizens, should our elected officials really talk like that about us to a member of the press, right? It wasn't just Larry Rich, the dude that lives up on Jackson, right? It was Larry Rich, the mayor of Roseburg.
Mhm. Should an elected official be speaking like this about? It's a good question. I would lean toward no. It is also true. And I do like when politicians tell the truth.
Well, and it may be because I just hung out with too many lawyers in my life, but but you know, I believe it's true, right? That is an assessment, that I'm willing to say, but I also understand the potential liability risk of calling somebody a fraudster, right? Defaming somebody. And I
Yeah, there's a lawsuit
the
right
bad,
there. There's a lawsuit
huh?
right there. Yeah. And who's going to have to pay for that?
We are. So we'll see how this actually turns out. Because there, ironically, Bernie may have grounds to go after the city because of the mayor's statement. And he could have characterized problems. I think I posted somewhere. It would have been better if he kind of enumerated specific issues, right, that are fact-based issues.
Mhm.
And he could acknowledge city staff has a problem with it, right? Has a problem dealing with some of these issues. There are things, but to say he's a fraudster, and I did post the description, the legal description of fraud on my Facebook page, in the discussion, because I think that Bernie's behavior does indicate even the legal description of fraud, not criminal fraud, but civil fraud. And there's both kinds, and the standard is, higher for criminal fraud. And so, it may wash out, but then I don't think our public officials should be calling any citizen names. And when I say citizen, I mean people who show up, a citizen of the world, whoever you are. You go to a public, you participate in the, civic life, and you should not have to worry about being called names by your public officials. However, in this city, rumor tells me they do it behind your back. So do you want it, out there in public? Or you just want them to gossip about you behind your back?
Mhm. Well, it seems more condemning of the mayor himself in calling Bernie Woodard a fraudster, because the mayor himself has he's facilitated and basically allowed for this regime of cruelty against the unhoused people in our community that have placed a fair number of them straight into the hands of this quote fraudster.
Yep.
Bill Mayor Rich is at fault for that, among other people, but he's the mayor. He's setting the agendas here.
Yep. That's kind of the way that I look at it as well. How about you, John? I think you already said it. The pot calling the kettle black.
Yeah, well, one of the things I found really interesting in that JPR article is that even if people are working in these camps, Bernie still requires 3 hours a day free labor out of them, which kind of really shocked me in a way. I mean, I thought that was pretty ridiculous. I mean, if you got a person that's doing their duty of working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, like what the system wants you to do, Bernie's demanding another 21 hours a week for free, and, and that really blew me away. I mean, you could at least I charge them some rent or something, but expecting another 21 hours out of them after they're doing their what you could consider their civic duty of having a legitimate job, that he still wants to punish him.
Well, and when you listen to Joe's story, I mean, it's the 3 hours has always been 3 hours of free labor, no matter what
Yeah,
you do. And the problem is the city ordinance that allows these camps says they can't charge a fee. My beef with the city over a year ago, or around a year ago now, I contacted their community development person, who is the one that oversees the application, and said, hey, there's a fee. That's 3 hours of work a day. That amounts to, I think, $41.25 or whatever the heck it is a day to have a porta potty and be in one of those encampments.
Yeah, it is
Um,
payment with labor.
right, right. And so that's the one I joked last week that they just went radio silent, right? Well, we'll ask our lawyer, and then he didn't respond. And then I said, well, did you ask the lawyer? And then no response. So, that is then even more so my argument as to why the city is facilitating this, that they're not even willing to confront the reality that they are charging a fee. And if you go down to the camp on Pine, which is at the beginning of Pine Street by the railroad traction in that, where then a path over Deer Creek to go to the trail, the park trail. It says on there, the assign for the camp, no fees charged, no camping fee charged. Bernie says that, although it's 3 hours of labor, right? So he's trying to, and this is
Mhm.
where I think the idea of a con man, right? He's always kind of trying to skirt, oh, aha, it doesn't actually do this. We're not charging a fee. They're working, labor. That's not a fee because a fee has to be cash. It's, whatever they use to kind of rationalize that stuff.
Mhm.
Um,
It's typical
So they,
in American cities, politicians using criminals to do the dirty work for them. Think of like it's
yeah,
like what mobs have often served the role of.
that's true. Keeping the riffraff in shape, or at least in somewhat control, and they don't have to worry about all those pesky things like due process, fairness, violating constitutional rights. Um, and and the interesting thing, and I hope the other, I did reach out to the National Law Center for the Homeless as well, the person who was quoted in the Jefferson public radio story as well, that said these things are good, and I don't know that they even understood the full content between the labor camp and the private labor, right? So um the reality is there's this talk that this thing they're building in Utah is going to be a forced labor camp by the Trump administration for homeless people. Excuse me. The problem is, can the government criminalize homelessness and then force you into their labor camps? And then not necessarily is a private contractor using it for his or own personal business, but that's what Bernie Woodard's doing. That's what's happening. That they may do a civic project or two, cleaning out the Deer Creek thing that I think Octavia talked a little bit about that they were mentioning. Um, that is a civic project, right? Because that is a public waterway, and I might be viewed as that way. But that kind of mandatory work is usually when a court has been involved in the process and ordered you to do that, right? And it can be you're going to go do this or we're going to put you in jail, right? That is the power of the government itself. And so, and so the idea that there are places that have these labor camps, the thing I don't think is clear is that Bernie is using this for private businesses, his private business, for profit business, not a nonprofit. And, he actually, had set up a nonprofit, but has not officially even used that as the cover name, which, he could have attempted to do, but there is a provision in the law regarding 501c3 nonprofits and the use, because a 501c3 can exploit labor. You volunteer for us, right? You can volunteer for the government and they don't have to pay you. So that, but if you're using a 501c3 to really benefit your private financial enterprise, that's a no-no under IRS rules. That's a violation of the IRS code that establishes 501c3 type charities. And I use that number because they designate the ones that aren't just tax deductible, because there are lots of nonprofit organizations are tax exempt, the organization, but it's that tax deduction, and people rely upon that status to give them money, to give tents to the campers, to do those kinds of things that they probably wouldn't give to a private. If a labor contractor said, "Well, buy us a crummy," right? to transport our people, just donate it to us, raising the community. I don't think there'd be a whole lot of takers,
Mhm.
right? To for a private business to actually get that. So this will be an interesting thing to see what actually comes out of this. And it might get a lot more attention than what's limited to Southern Oregon. And at least now for SOPP's purposes, we have a story that has something to do with something more than just Douglas County, right? Because we're having, the grants pass. And we'll also see what happens in regard to, I did get a response from a couple of the city councilors, because, oh yes, I did send a letter. I did send an email after Brad's Pass made the decision on Monday. I said, I don't know if your city manager sent this to you, but apparently you didn't consider it when you made the decision to go with Elk Island. There is the city manager may not have given it to them. Um, that may have been, there's kind of this thing in due process kind of issues with contracting that everybody gets to be treated the same. But there has to be a fallacy when there's potential fraud going on, when there's potential labor trafficking, to say, oh, well, we don't get to see that because that wasn't part of our process to make it fair for everybody to apply for the grant. So we'll see how that pans out as well. So, anybody else have anything? I do know I put some other stuff there, but I think we covered most of it, except not the SNAP, not the food, right? Um,
Well, it's like it's I don't know. He just, of course, it's the way the whole system is he keeps doing this stuff and people know about it, and he keeps getting away with it. So that's I mean, the mayor may say he's a fraud, but he keeps going along doing it. And as a retired contractor, in a way, I'm amazed that he continues doing what he's doing. Using this free labor and doing really shoddy work, but he keeps getting jobs and doing them poorly and everything. And it's to me, it's just I don't know. It's just amazing. I guess he has a pretty good line of BS, but two people got on my post and talked about it and had pictures of the shoddy work that his crew did. Mm-hmm. And actually several years ago we redid a job that one of his crew members did, and it was a pretty simple job too. It's just you had to have some skill, and you had to have the desire to do it too. So it's like it's not a new thing with him, and he just keeps doing it. But it's kind of the way the system is, because I know there was one contractor that used to always report unbonded contractors to the builders board, and it never did any good. So it's just a frustrating thing.
Well, and I think you answered your own question about, why, you get away with it, right? That enforcement are. It's one of the things that really decimated like some certain environmental protections at workplace, OSHA protections, because of the failure of the system, even if we had those agencies, and I'm talking about before the Trump administration or the
Right.
NLRB labor complaints. If there's not a mechanism to actually enforce those rights, you don't have them. It's all well and good. It's on paper. I try to convince people living outside there are certain rights you do have. Yeah, and there are certain, and you will get some redress of them if you do what you need to do. If you go and file a complaint or if you
Yeah.
make a claim because they took your property, but people don't do it. I mean, people are so disempowered that it's kind of like, they don't even have the energy to contemplate the possibility of at least getting some compensation, particularly around their property. The property being thrown away is a relatively straightforward legal case. If they can prove they had the property and they asked for it and they said they didn't have it, they have a claim under both federal and state law for the loss of their property when the police do sweeps. But most people don't exercise that. I mean, the amount of property that we lose is significant. The amount of taxpayer property that is constantly being thrown away in these sweeps is crazy.
There's
So
also a basic ignorance, even though we might say, well, people know about this. Some people know that Bernie Woodard's no good. Might even
true.
might even recognize that there are potentially something nefarious or problematic afoot in those camps. But the ignorance, I think, is in a belief that many of us are inculcated with from youth that slavery and involuntary servitude are outlawed in the United States. Thus, what we're looking at is can't possibly be slavery or involuntary servitude.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not the case. The 13th Amendment has a stipulation that does retain legal slavery and involuntary servitude as punishment for crime. Um,
Yep.
so it is perfectly justified constitutionally. I'm not saying I'm agreeing with it, but
No.
constitutionally, it is allowed, and it's kind of expected that slavery, involuntary servitude, are considered legitimate forms of punishment. And so there's on the one hand, I think perhaps an acceptance of these circumstances that even if Larry Rich is calling Bernie Woodard a fraudster, I think that Mayor Rich must think to some degree it's acceptable that he's a fraudster because these people need to be punished. That's why they're
Good point.
criminalized because
Yeah.
Mayor Rich and the city council have pushed forward ordinances that have criminalized people basically for being homeless.
Yeah.
So this is just
And
another form of punishment.
mhm,
But
that's absolutely true.
where there's a an ignorance is that they're not willing to admit what this actually is, because then it would, of course, reveal Roseburg City Council as and Mayor Rich as being involved in human trafficking.
Yeah. And, it's this whole mentality that the personal moral failure, your personal moral failure is criminal, right?
Yeah,
So, they look at homelessness as an individual's personal moral failure. They got themselves homeless. So it's their fault. They need to solve it. And if they're bothering our society and the more respectable citizens, then it's okay to criminalize that behavior,
yeah,
right? Even though it really should not rise to the level of a crime.
yeah. And with the the ingrainment of what's usually called neoliberalism since the late 1970s, uh, which entails the gutting of state-sponsored public services and pumping everything into private enterprise,
Hmm.
profiteering enterprise. That is handing over even the management of the community, the or basic institutions in any city, town, county, over to capital ultimately, puts everyone at the mercy of capital. And I'll put my historian hat on again. In the last like 20 years, the the scholarship done by US historians on the development of the market economy and market society in the United States is increasingly recognizing that slavery and fraud are fundamental to such a society and economy. Fraud is not some kind of exception, but fraud, trickery, uh, corruption, whatever you want to call these things, they are they are essential features of capitalism. And so if we are handing our unhoused neighbors over to private enterprise, we are inevitably and ultimately handing them over to, as Mayor Rich is saying, fraudsters. Inevitably,
Yeah.
fraudsters, profiteers. to enslavers, to traffickers. It's not just incidental. It's not just an accident. That is what is they are being handed over to. Even if it w weren't Bernie Woodard, it would be other parties who are filling that
Yes,
role, who are
right.
who are acting in trickery and are
Yeah,
exploiting people.
and the danger is other people will do it, right? That more capitalists will move into it. I mean, there's pallet shelters, right? These small shelters could have been built in communities, in schools and stuff that we've talked about. I've talked with other people about, shelters that's better than a tent. But, once that capitalism, got into it, it went from we could build probably $2,000 shelter to now it's $5,000, $10,000 shelters, right? That now the system, the homeless, industrial complex, has done that. And they're no better. And when you say, okay, if my motive is money for my company, then all the other reasons we don't like the privatization of other stuff is okay when you need a heavy intensive social service and housing component, then how you gonna it's that service component that is really critical not to be cheap about, right
Mhm.
there. And this is and our failure to address some of those is why we still have a big problem with homelessness, because no matter how much money has been fueled in the system, we haven't filled that service gap. We do not, and it's not never been filled here. Even with all the money from the pandemic coming in, it's never been filled here. There is supposed to be a work session for the city council to talk again about the urban campground because their last issue went bust. It's the 17th. It's supposed to, I don't know where it's going to be. I don't know if it's on the web page. I did ask somebody and they weren't sure. It has been sometimes in where the police department is, those conference rooms. So I don't know that normally people don't get to talk during them. So I know that Housing for Umpqua is going to submit kind of an outline of the stuff that we already had prepared prior to this, about the safe ground, right? Promoting that kind of concept and not this, infusion of money for a big infrastructure. But we're going to submit that beforehand because I don't think they'll let us present anything at their work session. And what else? Uh, Anybody want to talk about anything else? I say we have about 20 minutes because my computer is telling me you're gonna die.
I've got another meeting to get to, so I've got nothing else.
No. How about you, John?
No, I just we have that banquet on Thursday at the Rainbow Kitchen at 6 p.m. for a fundraising thing for Uncle Tito and his children in Gaza. So anybody that listens to this, I want to attend. I hope you can. It should be in a fun time, and we're gonna have a couple video clips of Uncle Tito and what he does in Gaza. So
I've been letting people know about it. I do plan on showing up,
okay,
and
good. I'm
I
gonna
think it's a
resend.
great,
I'm gonna resend all the notice out tomorrow or so too. So to
yeah,
remind people. So
yeah. I think it's a great thing to have in the community, period. So I hope we have other communities and that need to be connected. I just want to mention I do spend time in the Democratic Party office every couple of weeks, and someone from the Latino community, Spanish speaking community, um, has come in the office a few times, most recently the last time I was in there, and wanting to know what they can do because they're concerned about what's happening, right? And we're talking about somebody who is a citizen of the United States but not born here, and we're having a few discussions about how afraid people in the community are, right, about
right,
what's happening. And there may be an issue. I don't know if folks saw that the ICE was allegedly in Cottage Grove uh,
Yeah,
Saturday,
they've been hitting
Friday.
Eugene harder this last week. I've been getting
Yeah,
word from the union.
Yeah. I did ask them, and this was before that raid in Eugene. I did ask the person if they had seen any evidence of ice here, because I can't say that we have, and they said they had not. But I wonder if they've gone to Cottage Grove, are they going to try? We're not that big of a community, but we do have a good number of Latinos. I mean, we
Right.
have enough that, so try to figure out how we could support them, and that was really the question. And I said, what kind of support do you want? Do you need from us? So I think that is going to might be on the horizon, that we have to, as a community, do a little bit more than just say we oppose what's happening or protest
Mhm.
um, ICE stuff.
For easiest thing to do for anyone listening is talk to your neighbors, especially those who you think are potentially vulnerable. Get their phone number, get their contact information, and you tell them, you know, come stay with us for a bit if you need to.
Yeah, that's good.
And
That's a good
I,
point.
I'm gonna give you the answer. I'm gonna give you the historian's answer. Like people are comparing this to Nazi Germany, and what did decent people do? They took
Yes.
in people who were being hunted, even to the point of hiding them under floorboards.
Yeah. That's a good point. And that is something that we should all be willing to do. And hopefully people are. And that's a really good point. And it may be something that our local Democratic Party should get more proactive, as they say, in at least putting out information and encouraging people on practical ways to help, and just saying, as my, friend who was raised in Texas says, oh, ain't it awful? Right? Instead of just saying, oh, ain't it awful, is there something, that actually is meaningful for us to do? Because
Yeah,
we can speak out against it, but that doesn't help if somebody's being targeted by ICE and has nowhere to go.
yeah, and stay away from using digital services for this kind of thing. If you want to exchange contact information, use some pen and paper. And don't
That's a
don't do what
very, very,
Indivisible does for demonstrations and get everyone's name, email, and address on a big old list. That's really useful for anyone who would have it out for Indivisible.
well, funny you say that, is the guy that came in to talk to me the first time I met him was a few months ago, and he wanted to know about the protest. But then he was, kind of sheepishly saying, well, do you have to sign up? And give your name. And I said, no. And tell all the people, no. They don't have to tell anybody their name. You want to just show up, you know, you do not. You're absolutely right. That's, even though I'm willing, sometimes to do it, that's a ridiculous thing to.
Yeah.
And until more recently, I've been okay, cybersecurity, I know all about it. I've always been a believer. If the FBI wants to know who you are as an activist, they already know who you are, right? My dad's life and, the McCarthy era was a real good signal. They didn't even have computers like they do now. They find you. But I even, downloaded Signal, as a communication. um, and I'm interested in learning about cybersecurity, because I think it is, unfortunately, time that we kind of think about, ways to keep in contact that aren't as easily traceable as this is, right?
Yeah. This is a great time to talk to any friend of yours who knows what Linux is.
Yes, I know what it is. I don't want to know any more about it. That's my problem. But you're right. And that was when I was in the Pacific Green Party. It's funny you say that. This is the platform we should use. And I'm like, but nobody but you guys can use it. Okay. So, I mean, this is a couple of decades ago. It actually is better, but we want our GUIs, right? Graphical user interface.
Right.
What would I do without it? Might find out. All right. Thanks. Any suggestion for contact